There is a car park behind a pub on Kuyu Street in Griffith, New South Wales. On Friday, the 15th of July, 1977, at about 6:30, a man walked out of that pub and across that car park toward a panel van with his family name painted along the side. 7 hours later, the van was still there. So was his blood. So were 3 spent cartridges. His body has never been found, nearly 50 years. And here is where the title of this film is wrong. Nobody was hiding anything. The town knew, the police knew, and 3 Griffith detectives later went to prison for protecting it. The newspapers had been printing it since 1974. A royal commission would name 6 men, and not one of them was ever prosecuted. The Mafia did not secretly run Griffith. It ran Griffith in plain sight, and knowing changed nothing. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. A town drawn in circles. Before 1912, this country was a semi-arid plain. Wiradjuri country, flat and hot, running out toward the hay plains, growing saltbush and not much else. The rainfall was not enough for orchards and never had been. Then engineers brought water to it and did it on a scale that is hard to picture now. The Murrumbidgee irrigation area was one of the largest public works schemes this country had attempted. Burrinjuck Dam upstream, Berembid Weir on the Murrumbidgee, and 139 kilometres of canals cut across the plain to move water where the rain would not go. Farmland was made available from 1912, and the land responded the way engineers had promised it would. Country that grew saltbush started growing citrus, rice, stone fruit and vines. Then, in 1914, the state hired an architect. Walter Burley Griffin and his wife and partner, Marion Mahoney Griffin, were the Americans who had just won the competition to design Canberra. They drew the plans for 2 riverina towns, Leeton and Griffith, and they drew them the way they drew capital cities: concentric circular streets, avenues radiating out from a centre, parks in the wedges between, and a broad main street with a planted median running down the middle of it called Banna Avenue. Look at Griffith on a map today and you are looking at a diagram of order, drawn deliberately in the middle of nowhere, and the town settled into 2 halves, which is a geographic fact and nothing more than that. There is the civic town, Banna Avenue, the shops, the council chambers, the clubs, the churches. And ringed around it, there is the farming district, Hanwood, Yenda, Ugali, Bilbul, Tharbogung, blocks and channels and pumps, the town where the decisions were made and the country where the water went. By the 1930s, the scheme had done what it was built to do. Griffith was proclaimed a town in 1918 and would be proclaimed a city in 1987, and in between it became the centre of one of the most productive agricultural districts in Australia. Rice, citrus, stone fruit, wine grapes, and later poultry and cotton, all of it downstream of a decision made in an office hundreds of kilometres away to move a river. The whole place rests on a single proposition, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the only thing in this film that never changes. If you bring water to a plain, it will grow whatever you put in it. There is one more thing worth knowing about the design, because it matters later. Griffin drew a town you can see across. The circles are open, the avenues are wide, the median down Banna Avenue is planted but low. It is not a town of alleys and blind corners. It is a town where, structurally, it is very difficult to do anything without being observed. Remember that too. Chapter 2. Enemy aliens. Italians were in the irrigation area almost from the day it opened. The first arrived in 1913, and the early families were mostly Venetai, from the hill villages above Treviso in the north of Italy. They took the blocks nobody else wanted and they worked them. By the end of the 1920s, Italian families owned 67 farms in the irrigation area. By 1940, it was 230, and on the 10th of June, 1940, Italy entered the war. Under the National Security Act, resident Italians became enemy aliens. According to the National Archives of Australia, around 20% of all Italians living in Australia were interned, and at the peak of the war, Australia held more than 12,000 people in internment camps. Two of those camps were at Hay and Cowra, both on the Riverina's doorstep, both within a couple of hours of Griffith. Hay held around 1,000 internees in each of three compounds at its peak: Italians, Germans, Japanese, and the men of the Dunera. So men were taken off farms that their own families had cleared and levelled and planted, and put behind wire a short drive from home. In some households, while the father was interned as a security risk, a son was serving in Australian uniform. Then comes the detail that is almost too neat to be true, and it is fully documented. From the middle of 1943, Australian farmers were offered Italian prisoners of war as farm labour, not guarded. The Australian War Memorial records that over 12,000 Italian prisoners of war were eventually employed unguarded in rural work across the country. So in the same years, in the same countryside, you had both at once. Italian civilians interned as a danger to the nation, and Italian prisoners of war, captured fighting Australians in North Africa, driving tractors on Australian farms without a guard in sight. And it did not end with the war. In 1947, the Full Court of New South Wales upheld the Irrigation Commission's right to refuse farm transfers to persons of Italian origin, whether naturalised or not. The John Darien Club in Griffith did not admit Italians until 1959. Now, does any of that explain the silence that came 30 years later? It is a reasonable inference, and it is not a finding. Nobody has ever proved it, and this film is not going to claim otherwise. But you cannot understand why a community did not walk into a police station in 1975 without knowing what the police and the courts of this country had done to that community in 1942. There is a particular cruelty in the timing that is worth naming. These were people who had come to Australia in the 1920s specifically to get away from poverty and, in some cases, from Mussolini. They had taken the worst blocks. They had made them productive. And in 1940, the country they had chosen decided that the accident of where they were born outweighed everything they had done since they got here. After the war, a second wave arrived, and it came from somewhere very specific. Chapter 3. Calabria. The post-war migration to Griffith was Calabrian, and it was chain migration, which means it did not come from all over Italy. It came from a handful of towns in the Aspromonte Mountains, in the far south, and above all from one of them. The town is called Plati. The commonly repeated estimate is that something like 5,000 of Plati's 9,000 people migrated to Australia between 1950 and 1970. Treat that as an estimate rather than a census, because that is what it is. A great many of them came to the Riverina, and specifically to Griffith, because that is where the people from their village already were. Now, here is the explanation you will be given for that in Griffith today by people who live there. Ask why the Calabrians came, and you will be told about Al Grasby, that the Federal Minister for Immigration was himself a Calabrian, and that he opened the door for his own people, and that some of the people who walked through it were not the nicest. You can watch a local man say exactly that on camera in a walking tour of the town posted online. It is false. Albert Jaime Grasby was born in Brisbane in 1926 to a Spanish father and an Irish mother. His grandfather was a fisherman from Malaga named Jaime Gras, who changed the name. Grasby was not Italian. He was not Calabrian. He had no family connection to Calabria at all. And the chronology kills the story independently, even if the ancestry had been right. The Calabrian migration to Griffith was already well underway in the early 1950s. Al Grassby did not become Minister for Immigration until 1972, by which time the families had been in the district for 20 years and the marijuana trade was about to start without any help from him. We will come back to Al Grassby later in this film because there is a real story there and it is considerably worse than the invented one. But the important thing about that migration is the thing that gets lost. The overwhelming majority of those families did precisely what they had come to do. They cleared blocks. They planted vines and citrus. They built one of the most productive agricultural districts in Australia, and they had nothing whatever to do with what a small number of men started doing around 1972. It is also worth understanding what chain migration actually does to a place, because it is not a criminal phenomenon, it is an ordinary human one. A man from a village gets established. He sponsors a brother. The brother sponsors a cousin. And within 20 years, half a village in southern Italy has been reassembled in a district in southern New South Wales with the same names, the same dialect, and the same obligations. That process built the Riverina's farms and it built half the productive agriculture in this country. It is the same process that, in a very small number of families, carried something else across with it, which was to work out that the same water that grew grapes grew something else, and that it was worth a very great deal more. Chapter 4. Grass Castles. Marijuana growing began in the Griffith district in earnest around 1972 or 1973, and the economics of it were not close to being a contest. A Riverina fruit block was a hard living. A family could work a 9-hectare property all year and clear a few $100s. Reported returns on marijuana in that district ran to something in the order of $1 million an acre. That is the entire mechanism. Everything that follows comes out of that gap. And here is how it was proved, which is the part almost nobody tells, because it was not proved by drug squads or informants. It was proved by an accountant. The Royal Commission's forensic accountant was William Fisher QC, and he did not chase drugs. He chased paper, tax returns, land titles, bank records, building applications. They called it the paper chase, and what it turned up was extraordinary. One Griffith farmer with a 9-hectare block had an average net income of $399 a year between 1969 and 1972. In 1975, he built a house shell valued at around $190,000, with $8,000 of light fittings in it, $399 a year, a $190,000 house. You do not need a detective to see that. You need a calculator. The town had a name for those houses: grass castles. And the phrase was not local folklore, which is worth correcting. Donald Mackay coined it himself in a dossier he compiled in July 1975, playing on the title of Mary Dirac's Australian classic Kings in Grass Castles. Now something has to be said clearly, once and properly, before this film goes any further. The people in Griffith today who carry the surnames in this story are farmers, winemakers, mechanics and shopkeepers. They are the overwhelming majority of the people who carry them, and they did nothing. This film is about a small number of men, most of them now dead, and about a system that protected them. It is not about a town and it is not about a community, but this is the part the town itself has never disputed. And that is the thing that separates Griffith from almost every other organised crime story you will ever hear. There was nothing to uncover. In a town Griffin had designed so that you could see across it. In a farming district where everybody knew what everybody's block was worth, houses went up that could not possibly have been paid for by the land they stood on. It was not a secret. It was architecture. You could see the houses. Everybody could see the houses. And there is a reason the trade worked here specifically, beyond the water and beyond the isolation. Marijuana grown in the Riverina had to be sold in Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, which meant crossing state lines. In the 1970s, that was very close to a guarantee of safety because a New South Wales detective had no power in Victoria and a Victorian detective had none here. There was no national police force to speak of. The border was not an obstacle to the trade. The border was the trade's single best asset, and everybody involved understood that perfectly well. In February 1974, police found a crop at Tharbogang, just outside Griffith, and a woman in that town read what happened next in the local paper, and couldn't let it go. Chapter 5. Koleambali. 2 men were convicted over the Tharbogang crop, just outside Griffith, in February 1974. The fines were $500 and $250. Barbara Mackay wrote to the Area News about it, anonymously first in June 1974, then again under her own name the following February. Her point was simple, and on the face of the sentencing, it was unanswerable. A young man caught with a single marijuana cigarette in New South Wales could go to jail. Men caught with a plantation had paid less than a speeding ticket. Her husband ran the furniture shop on Banna Avenue, and because he was known to be interested, and because he was known to be straight, people began quietly giving him information. Donald Mackay did not investigate anything, and he never claimed to. He was a furniture retailer. What he did was pass what he was told to the drug squad in Sydney, because he had concluded that passing it to anyone closer to home would achieve nothing. On the 10th of November, 1975, acting on what he had passed on, police raided a property at Koleambali, about 62 kilometres south of Griffith. What they found there was, at that time, the largest single marijuana crop ever discovered in Australia. And look at where it was growing. Irrigated country, the same channels, the same Murrumbidgee water, the same public engineering that had turned the riverina into a food bowl and put citrus on the plain. The water did not know the difference. The water has never known the difference. Bring water to a plain and it will grow whatever you put in it. And in 1975, somebody put that in it. Now, the figures, and this film is going to be straight about them because the audience will check. The front page of the Area News on the 12th of November 1975 read $1 million raid. Over the line, 50-acre marijuana crop, biggest ever. Modern retellings of the same raid put the value anywhere between $25 million and more than $100 million in today's money, and the area at anywhere between 50 acres and 32 hectares. Those numbers do not reconcile with each other. 50 acres is about 20 hectares, not 32. This film is not going to pretend they reconcile, and consider what it took to grow it in the first place. 32 hectares or 50 acres, depending on whose figure you take, is not a few plants behind a shed. It is a farm. It needs irrigation, machinery, labour, transport, and somewhere to dry and process the crop. It cannot be done quietly, and it cannot be done alone. A crop that size needs a district that is not asking any questions at all. The case came to trial in March 1977, and in that courtroom, somebody said out loud who had tipped off the police. Chapter 6. The Petition. Donald Bruce Mackay was born in Griffith on the 13th of September 1933, the son of Len Mackay, a house furnisher who had helped build the town's commercial district. He went away to school to Barker College in Sydney and came back home in 1955 to run the family furniture business on Banna Avenue. In 1957, he married Barbara Diamond. They had 4 children. He was a churchgoer, seriously and without performance. Apex, the Challenge Foundation, Birthright, which supported widowed parents. He is remembered in the town by people with no stake in the story as a genuinely decent man, which is the sort of description that usually means very little, and in his case turned out to mean everything. He was, in the flattest possible description, a well-regarded local businessman who did a lot of committee work. He also stood for Parliament 3 times as a Liberal and lost 3 Tims. Murrumbidgee in 1973 and again in 1976, and Riverina in 1974, where his preferences helped unseat the sitting member, Al Graspy. One small correction while we are here, because this film is trying to be accurate about a man other people have been careless about. The memorial in Banna Avenue calls him the second son. The Australian Dictionary of Biography calls him the third and youngest child. It is a small thing and it changes nothing. It is worth being straight about anyway. At the Coleambally trial in March 1977, 4 of the 5 accused were convicted. 1 escaped conviction on what Mackay considered a technicality. He did not go quiet after that. He went louder. He wrote to the area news that same month. He organised a petition calling for stronger drug laws, gathered 2,000 signatures in a town of that size, and had it presented to the New South Wales Parliament in May. The memorial that stands in the main street today puts it in a single phrase. He became the public face of those who opposed this destructive practice. He was receiving threats by then, and everyone around him knew it. He kept going anyway. On the 12th of July 1977, a man calling himself Adams telephoned the furniture shop and asked Mackay to come to Jerilderie, about 2 hours away, to quote on an order. Mackay was busy. He sent an employee instead. Nothing happened, and the employee came back, and nobody thought about it again for a long time. He had no idea what had almost happened to him. There is a sentence in the memorial inscription that is easy to read past, and it should not be. Undeterred by the threats on his life that followed, Don continued his campaign. That is the whole man in one line. He knew. His family knew. The threats were not subtle and they were not occasional, and he was a furniture retailer in a country town with no protection of any kind, and he kept going anyway. 3 days later, he had a drink at the Hotel Griffith and walked out to his van. Chapter 7. 3 cartridges. Friday, the 15th of July, 1977. Mackay had been on local radio that day, still campaigning. In the evening, he had drinks at the Hotel Griffith on Kuyu Street, bought a cask of wine to take home, and left at about 6:30. It was dark by then. It is winter in the Riverina in July, and it gets dark early, and it gets properly cold. And a man walking to his van at 6:30 on a Friday is walking through an unlit car park. The van was found about 7 hours later, still sitting in the car park. It was a mini panel van with the furniture shop's name painted along the side of it, which is worth pausing on, because it means nobody had to guess who owned it or wonder who was walking toward it. His keys were underneath it. The van was locked. Beside it, on the ground, were 3 spent .22 caliber cartridge cases. They were later matched ballistically to a French-made pistol, a unique, a small, cheap, unremarkable weapon of a kind that could be bought almost anywhere. There were bloodstains matching his blood group. There were sheared head hairs. There were drag marks. And then nothing. There was no witness. It is a car park behind a hotel on a main street in a town of 20,000 people on a Friday evening in the middle of the town, and there was no witness that police were ever able to put in a courtroom. Nearly 3,500 people were questioned. Nobody ever found him. In 1984, a coroner found that Donald Mackay had died of willfully inflicted gunshot wounds. Here is what the town did, and it is the thing that makes Griffith different from other unsolved cases. Griffith did not wonder what had happened. The town's immediate conclusion, before any inquiry, before any evidence was tested, before anybody was charged with anything, was that Donald Mackay was dead, and that it was because of the campaign. Nobody in that town needed to be told what had happened, or why, or roughly by whom. They had been watching the houses go up for 3 years, 3 spent cartridges on the ground of a car park behind a pub. Hold on to that number, because this film is going to come back to it, and the arithmetic it belongs to is the worst thing in this story. And think about what the absence of a body actually does to a family. There was no funeral in the ordinary sense. There was no grave to visit. For his wife and his 4 children, there was a car park, a coroner's finding 7 years later, and a bust in the main street 20 years after that. His widow Barbara died in 2001, 24 years after that Friday evening, still not knowing where her husband was. 3 weeks later, the New South Wales government proclaimed a royal commission. It would find more than anybody expected, and far less than anybody needed. Chapter 8. 6 Men. The Royal Commission into Drug Trafficking was proclaimed on the 5th of August, 1977. Its sole commissioner was Justice Philip Woodward. It was sitting in Griffith within weeks, and it reported in November 1979 across 3 volumes. Woodward's central finding is worth hearing in his own words, because they are careful words and they were written by a judge. The disposal of Mackay, he wrote, was the result of an organised plan. He was disposed of by the organisation which I find existed in Griffith. He found that organisation to be a Calabrian cell of what its own members called the Honoured Society. L'Onorata Società. What is now more commonly called the Ndrangheta, which in 1979 was a word almost nobody in Australia had heard, and which Woodward was effectively telling the country had been operating inside a New South Wales farming town for years. He named Robert Trimble, a Griffith motor mechanic whose garage had been struggling badly before money started appearing, as its practical leader. And he named 6 men as involved in the murder of Donald Mackay. Now the sentence that has to travel with that one every single time. Every one of those 6 men had an alibi. Not one of them was ever prosecuted for the killing. 2 of them were reportedly out on a pub crawl with police officers on the night in question. Woodward asked for permission to search the grass castles, the houses the paper chase had identified, the ones everybody in town could see. He was refused. And here is the part that is not allegation, not commission finding, not rumour, but conviction, tested in a court. Detective Sergeant Jack Ellis of the Griffith Police had tipped off a local grower when crops were discovered. Ellis and 2 other Griffith detectives, Brian Borthwick and John Robbins, were convicted of conspiring to pervert the course of justice over a period of years. 3 detectives, the men whose job was to investigate the trade, went to prison for protecting it. And there is one more thing in the Griffith Police record from those years, and it is the detail that stops the room. A fruit inspector named Patrick Keenan reported a crop and named a grower. Days later, an itinerant man who also happened to be named Patrick Keenan was found dead in an irrigation ditch. Ellis led that investigation and ruled the death not suspicious. 2 men with the same name, one of whom had just informed on a marijuana crop, and the officer who had been tipping off growers decided there was nothing in it. Woodward himself was asked about it years afterwards. In 1989, on the ABC's Four Corners, 10 years after he had reported, he said plainly that he was disappointed at how little had changed as a result of everything he had found. He had run a 2-year royal commission, named an organisation, named its leader, named 6 men in connection with the murder, and then watched almost nothing happen at all. 10 years later, in a court in Melbourne, a man who had been part of the arrangement decided to talk. Chapter 9. Conspiracy. Gianfranco Tizzoni was a Trimbole associate. He was arrested in 1982 with marijuana, and in 1983 he turned informer. What he testified to was that he had been the middleman, that he had engaged a hitman he knew only as Fred, who was later identified as James Frederick Bazley. In October 1984, Tizzoni pleaded guilty in Melbourne to conspiracy to murder Donald Mackay, 8 years. He had turned because he had been caught, which is how these things almost always happen. In 1986, Bazley was convicted of conspiracy to murder Donald Mackay, and separately of the murders of 2 drug couriers, Douglas and Isabel Wilson. He was sentenced to life. He protested his innocence for the rest of his life and died in a Melbourne nursing home in 2018. George Joseph, the Melbourne gun dealer who supplied the pistol and recommended the man, was convicted of conspiracy. So here is the arithmetic, and it needs to be said slowly. 3 men were convicted. All 3 were convicted of conspiracy. Nobody has ever been convicted of the murder itself. Robert Trimble fled Australia on the 7th of May 1981, reportedly tipped off that he was about to be arrested. He lived in Ireland under the name Michael Hambury. He was arrested in Dublin in October 1984, and the Irish High Court ruled the arrest unlawful and ordered his release. He died near Alicante, in Spain, in mid-May 1987 of heart disease, aged 56. He was never convicted of Donald Mackay's murder. In a life that a royal commission described in those terms, the only conviction ever recorded against Robert Trimble was for tax offences. And then there is Al Grassby, and the real story, which as promised is worse than the invented one. In 1980, Al Grassby was charged with criminal defamation over a document which imputed that Donald Mackay's own widow, Barbara, and the family's solicitor were responsible for his disappearance. He had asked a member of the New South Wales Parliament to table it. A special inquiry conducted by John Nagle QC found that no decent man could have spread such scurrilous lies. Grassby lost a civil suit brought by Barbara Mackay and apologised unconditionally. And in August 1992, after a 12-year legal fight, Al Grassby was acquitted on appeal and awarded $180,000 in costs. Allegations that he had been paid by Griffith Mafia figures to circulate that document surfaced in the press after his death in 2005. They have never been tested in any court, and he is not here to answer them. And it is worth noticing what did come out of it, because something did. The failures exposed in Griffith, and particularly the way a state border had defeated 2 state police forces, contributed directly to the creation of the National Crime Authority in 1984, the first Australian body designed to investigate organised crime across jurisdictions. It came too late for Donald Mackay by 7 years, which is the way these things usually go. So what did the town get for all of it? Chapter 10. The Town That Knew. Before the verdict, the other argument deserves its best version, because you will hear it in Griffith and you will hear it in the comments underneath this film. It goes like this: the money came in and the money stayed. It capitalised businesses, bought plant and machinery, planted vines, put roofs on buildings. Some of the families in this district built enterprises that are now large, entirely legitimate and genuinely award-winning, employing hundreds of people in a town 4 hours from the nearest capital city. And the district did become one of the great agricultural successes in the country. Griffith City Council markets the region as growing 90% of Australia's rice and prunes, and as the largest citrus region in the nation. One wine company headquartered in the district accounts for something in the order of 16% of all Australian wine exports, shipping well over 100 million bottles a year. Those are the town's own promotional figures, and they are worth attributing rather than simply asserting, but the underlying success is real. There are people in Griffith who will tell you the era brought work and order, and they are not lying about what they saw. Now, the other side of the ledger. The same arrangement corrupted the police, who were meant to protect that town, and that is not opinion. It was proven in court, 3 of them. It got a federal member of Parliament charged over a document blaming a widow for her own husband's disappearance. It produced a royal commission that named 6 men and prosecuted none of them for the killing. And it murdered a furniture retailer with a wife and 4 children, whose only offence was telling the police what people had told him. Order bought at that price is not order. It is a protection racket that an entire town paid for over years, without ever once being asked whether it wanted to. So here is the whole thing, flat in the order it happened. The town knew. The newspapers printed it from 1974. The police who were supposed to investigate it were convicted of protecting it. The Royal Commission named the men and was refused permission to search their houses. The man who informed was named in open court. The minister the town still blames for the migration had never in his life been within 1,000 miles of Calabria, and the only convictions anybody ever got were for conspiring to murder a man whose body has never been found. 3 cartridges in a car park, 3 men convicted, all of conspiracy. 3 detectives convicted of protecting them. 6 men named by a royal commission, and nobody at all in nearly 50 years convicted of the murder. A reward of $200,000 has sat unclaimed since 2012 in a town where a great many people have always been fairly sure they know the answer. Walk Banna Avenue today and you will find a food and wine town of about 20,000 people, more than 60 nationalities, and the highest proportion of Italian ancestry of any local government area in New South Wales. About a quarter of the population, incidentally, not the 60% you will sometimes be told. You will find a fairy firefly mounted on a pylon, put up in 1969 by a returned serviceman named Charlie Beltrame, because this was soldier settler country, and he wanted the memorial to be an aeroplane. And a short walk from it, on the corner of Banna and John Darien, a white marble bust erected by the citizens of the town in 2008, with a line from Edmund Burke cut into the plinth. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Most of the open channels have been piped and put under the ground now. You can walk the whole length of the main street of Griffith and not see any water at all. But it is still running, still feeding the blocks, still growing whatever anybody plants in it. The town covered its water over a long time ago. It has never been able to dig up its dead.